Welcome to Creative Engineering. We have another exciting episode today. Today we have Simon Lightfoot. How are you doing, Simon?
Hey, good, thanks.
And we also have my co-host, Norbert. How are you doing?
I'm doing great too.
So Simon, how about you tell a little bit about yourself? I know you've been using Flutter for quite a bit now, actually.
It's always the hardest bit of introducing me because I've just been around for a long time.
Yeah.
So I guess in general, I've been programming for a good part of 20 years, I think. I've lost track. And then 10 years professional Android development. And then finally last few years, I normally said 2, but I think it's 3 years now. Time flies, but I've been doing Flutter. So we started Flutter mid-alpha.
Nice.
And so I've gone to the community, and from my perspective, we needed it. So I'm also CTO at Dev Angels London, a small development agency doing apps. And we had a problem, the fact that we have Android expertise, but not much iOS expertise in the company. And Flutter, so we were at, Google Developer Agency Day Europe, what name? But, there was an introduction done, I forget his name, it's terrible with names, but there was an introduction done about Flutter, and I was like, all through the slides it's talking about the JavaScript bridge and how it's different from the other ones, and I'm like, oh my God, I heard about Flutter like 6 months previous, and I completely disregarded it. I was like, this is going to be terrible, it's another cross-platform piece of garbage, this is not what I want as an Android developer. And then when he started explaining what it does and how it works, I'm like, actually, this is what I've wanted for years. This is really what I want. And I just immediately tried it out that same day. And before I knew it, we transitioned the company up to using Flutter. I think literally within the quarter afterwards. So very fast transition. And all our apps since have been Flutter apps.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think you've been doing a lot of the web stuff as well. What do you feel like have you noticed a big improvement over the past year or so?
Oh, definitely. So I actually, I was invited to try out Flutter Web before it was released and give some feedback, which I did. And back then it was it was a separate project, right? It was a separate library. It was completely separate from the framework, and they've integrated that into the framework now. Performance is way better. They've all those sort of edge cases they've kind of sort of whittled down to very few now. However, when I recently required to use it for an actual project of Dev Angels, and in doing so, I found there's some other things that weren't covered. So I've put some PRs back into the framework. So dealing with things like get rid of that annoying hash in the URL. I mean, it makes sense. Yes. Don't get me wrong. However, I don't like it.
Yeah, I'm kind of both ways on it. Like, I feel like it's nice because most static websites, single page applications use this, but at the same time, it's bad for linking.
I can give you exactly one problem that you can actually have.
Okay.
Apple's, I think, I'm going to quote, this might be a misquote, but if I remember rightly, I was implementing Apple sign-in recently, and it strips off the location from the URL.
Wow.
So you can't have the hash and the path as part of the URL when you redirect back after OAuth 2.
Right, and that would
which is actually not part of the standard, I don't believe. But I might be muddling up there with another provider, I'll be honest with you. It's been a while. But it's just that kind of nature of those little things where the hash is meant to be a local thing, not a remote thing. So if you do need to deep link or link into your app, you do need that kind of direct path manipulation rather than what's called location, right?
So before, you can remove the hash from the framework, I was actually getting around it by creating, when you deploy to Firebase, I would have a redirect. So I'd take the redirect and then redirect to another page. So then externally, I would have my redirect link that would then, without a hash, that would go then to the page with a hash.
It's all about numbers of requests at that point and latency and other things.
So we have a little bit of follow-up, actually. Dart just announced null safety. I know we've all been waiting for that. So what do you guys think about that?
So, it's a pretty big deal. They've been working on this for quite some time. I think this is like the feature which pushes the language by quite a bit. Like a lot of modern languages, for example, Kotlin. I'm not sure. Swift, they all have the sense of non-nullability. They notice that null pointer exceptions aren't that fun. And that DAR is also implementing this is like a huge step in becoming a asset to Flutter. Like a lot of people were complaining, okay, Flutter is cool, but Dart. But with this feature and
wait for it. What's that? Why can't we use Kotlin, right?
Yes.
Kotlin has this.
At some point, people were like, will be like, okay, cool, we have Dart. That's a great thing. That's like the language you want to use.
I mean, this one of the conversations I had with early adopters when we were doing a Joy-Con London a few years ago was people were saying that, why can't we use Kotlin? I'm like, well, Google run the entire stack, right? Essentially, I mean, run, but you know what I mean? Like they essentially own the entire stack, meaning that they can make changes to the language that suits Flutter and vice versa. So as we've seen, we saw the, I can't remember his name, Magnificent Bob, whatever his name is. He did the language changes for the, I forget what they're called, collection expressions. I can't remember what they're called. I think there was that's what they're called, where you can put your if statements and your for loops inside of array declarations.
Spread operators
As well, yeah. And that is perfectly what we needed for Flutter. However, it was a language design change, right? These are the things that we get with being able to have the entire stack, right? And again, non-nullability, right? Like having this non-null by default. They can implement that language and really like do this overhaul, because it is essentially a big overhaul of the entire framework just to support that. Actually, I submitted a PR on date time. So when you're passing this is a bit off topic, but when you pass a date time back from, I think it was an Azure backend, it formats the date time with like 10 decimal places for the microseconds, and Dart only accepts 6. Right? And just because of the position from 80-bit to 64-bit or something like that. However, the difference is it would fail passing the date time, not just ignore the lower bit, right? Which is kind of what you want. You don't want it to fail passing. You have to trim the string and then reattach like the time zone and do other weird things just to get to pass the date time. Is ridiculous. So I put a PR in there and it got approved and it got fixed. But I had to. The key here is I had to implement it in the non-null by default, as well as the normal tree. There was 2 different trees active. I'm not sure if that's the case now or not, but yeah, again, like I've tried out. If anyone doesn't know, there's I think it's nullsafety.dartpad.dev.
Yes,
I think.
Yeah, I think it's just part of the regular Dartpad now, right? Because I think
no, there's a separate. Well, I don't know. I know they're advertising a separate.
Okay,
I'm going to check it now. Actually, just because nullsafety.dartpad.dev.
Cool.
And you can try out all the null safety changes, but I mean, as I was saying, I think we were saying that Flutter itself is not null safe by default at the moment, right? The Flutter, the framework isn't, but Dart and its core SDK is. That's what the tech preview brings, right? So you still can't build your Flutter apps as non-null by default at the moment. That's going to come in this, hopefully in the sim future, right? But there's still migration work to be done. Like, so, I mean, null has been used and has been used in programming for I don't know how many years I've used null and had null pointer exceptions. And trust me, you don't want to even think about null problems in C and C++ code, because then you're talking about, especially when you're talking about like triple dereferences and somewhere there's a null pointer somewhere you're having to deal with. This is a nightmare. So like in Flutter, like raise button, the callback, so you do on press, and if you pass null, you'll disable the button, right? Explicit use of null should be frowned upon. It's perfectly possible, right? So I think the first version of the Flutter framework we'll probably see is where they just say that can be null, right? I think it's the exclamation mark or question mark you put after the type and just say, no, this optional, yeah. Basically saying this can be null if you want, which you'll probably see. But then I feel like there's a reason for us to then start porting our code to these things, like rather than having, I'll give you a use case I can think of. When you log into an app, right, might have in your app code where you're logged in and you say, oh, if I have a user object in my user stream or something, then I'm logged in. If I have null, I'm not logged in, right? The point here is we want to frown away from doing that and instead have a constant value of like user.none. So have a static constant inside your user model called none, which is a blank implementation of user, which has blank strings for names and so on. You can then do a direct comparison because it's a static const and say, is this object identical to this other object? It is, so it's not logged in right now. So there's never a case where you see null on that stream. And that's kind of the thing that you need to think about when doing non-null by default and you can always start moving towards that. But that's just a good programming practice. You can already do that right now, right? That doesn't involve the new operators. New operators are more about null management, allowing you to use null where you want to. But to be honest, if you can avoid using it altogether, why not?
And so does this remove the need for using asserts? Or reduces the amount that we would use them? Because I feel like the Flutter uses that almost always just to check.
So this is kind of my curious point, because named parameters, right? When you don't specify named parameters, default to null. Therefore, all named parameters are what default to null. I've not had enough playing around with the null safety stuff to really look into that in high detail. Like for me personally, when it gets released and when I have to deal with it, I'll deal with it then. I know this, I just don't have the time to really look that far down the rabbit hole right now.
Because, like, do you need to use required at that point?
Oh, well, they have the new, isn't there? There's a new operator late, which solves some issues. Well, no, with that.
I mean, for specifically for constructor object, like, do you need a required? Because, like, if it's non-nullable,
yeah, but the required is just an annotation, right?
Yeah, but we were using it right now to make sure that it's like you were signifying that it has to.
Well, no, it's just done at compile time, right? But at runtime, you can still pass null. That's why you have those certs, right?
Yeah, you're right.
So the annotation is just there for as a compiler flag, right? As a hint to the compiler to say that this should never be null, right? But there's times that can be done analyzed during static analysis, right? Not at dynamic runtime.
But I think with required, you can still explicitly pass a null and it won't complain, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So
that's what the assert catches.
Can you, or it's just when you have a variable that's null? I think
required only makes sure that you actually pass
that
something.
You specify the parameter. You have to. That's it. So required says you have to specify the named parameter, but it can be null still, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, like these are the things that that the framework team are going to, the Flutter team itself are going to have to deal with and say, these are the rules that we're now going to run it by. But to be honest, asserts aren't in runtime. They're only in debug. So,
Oh, yeah, right.
It's not going to have any performance impact, or it shouldn't do. So, I was curious, actually. The stats on the blog post that was pushed out recently was like 19% performance increase. Not speed increase, performance increase. So that performance can obviously, I'm not trying to mince words here, but performance means generally like lots of things like memory, speed, CPU usage, frame rates, all sorts of other things, right? It's not just specifically how fast your code is run by the CPU, right? But in truthfulness, like if you don't have to check null or if there's no sort of, put it this way, in you end up doing preconditions all the time in C++ code where you're just saying, oh, it can't be null, essentially the same as the way we're using asserts right now, where you're basically telling it throw an exception if it's null. That's basically what the compiler's inserting for us, so that if it does find null at some point, you do try dereference a null, it will throw an exception, and that's all handled during the processing of the dark code itself, the compiled dark code. So.
Also,
I mean, when I first came from Swift, actually, I was very much used to the null safety and optional chaining and all that kind of stuff. Got into Kotlin, and then I came to Dart. So I've still been using question mark optional chaining for all this stuff, except for I just have to explicitly make sure I know which ones I expect to be null and which ones not.
Do we want to talk about some of the other Dart features while we're here? Because for sure. there is that kind of like. There is some of those nice things like having almost a data class. We just have your fields, and then you can do a constructor with this dot this dot this, and just have all you just specify here are my parameters with the this. They're all public final. You've got like your static immutable data class. Mm-hmm. Very nice. However, as soon as you want to say I want this to be private, now you can't do that. So right. So now you end up doing that weird thing where you have a in your finalize after the colon of your constructor. You end up doing the private equals the parameter passed in. You have to pull the types on the parameters again. Like these are little things that I feel like these are adjusted. It would make it that bit nicer to program with, but not critical, right?
Yeah, you're right.
But one of the things I'm going to say this now because you got me in this. It just reminded me. So you can't reference constructors, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You cannot. Like, there's no way of saying I want to pass a constructor as a method, which I really feel like you end up having to do a static method, right? That then calls the constructor or something like that, pass it in. It ends up just you end up bulking out your code. So a good example of this is what I do all the time, especially for my service level. I guess we'll get to architecture, but a static init method, right? So I have a private constructor and a static init method that returns a future of that class, right? So the idea here is that I can now initialize stuff asynchronously and then return my instance, right? I have to use a static method because you cannot have an asynchronous constructor in Dart, right? Like, it's just not a thing. Even you'd think that that's a factory method, right? I mean, essentially, there's a difference though between a static method and a factory method. A factory method is treated as a constructor, but it's a method of code, right? And it's run before the constructor, so you can get away with doing logic in there, right? And still have final class members, right? But then your static method is treated as a method, not as a constructor. So the two things don't align, and you kind of it'd be nice to see asynchronous factory methods, right? So then you can have asynchronous construction. Then it really be helpful to, I think, to a lot of the way that we do stuff in Dart, right? Imagine that you can do construct things in a chain and then return some sort of logic on them, and do that all in like a future stream, right? Sort of a pipeline.
Yeah, I like the way
I
Kotlin does data classes specifically. You can just type data before, and it does it does your equal operators, your hash code, your private getters, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's awesome. You can do it now with Dart, but you have to use code generation or.
Well, these are some of those. I think that there's a language board, right, on the Dart SDK, which sort of goes through some of the things. But they are following up on that one, as well as sealed classes, sealed unions.
Yeah.
All those kind of good things. Type aliasing, which I can't wait for, to be honest, because there's several times I want to use type aliasing. I'm just like, all right, why don't I have this?
Oh, versus type def. What do you mean by type aliasing?
So type def, and there's a good example of this. I'm going to mince his last name. Luke Pighetti.
Okay.
Is that his name? I can't remember how you pronounce his last name. He did this on his Twitter feed recently, and it was having a mixin. So you can like define a new class with different mixins, and you can essentially define an alias with these different traits, right? But then you try and do that with a normal class. You use the equals operator in between. It doesn't work, right? There's just some inconsistencies in the way it works.
Right.
And type aliasing does that thing where you can say, I'll give you an example of this. Actually, I had this recently. Well, one of the things we're missing, right, which I really like, this is terrible, what I like from Java was the enum class. Enum was a class, right? It's a base type, but it's also a class. I mean, I could add private member variables to an enum, right? So I have things, a very common case for me in terms of app development is that you have a set of defined states or things that you return to and from a server, for instance. Now, during the serialization, deserialization process, you're treating that as a string, right? Mm-hmm. But then you want to, when you receive that string, put it back into your typed object so that you can look at the type, look at other related variables to that type. So they might be your private. So for example, you might get back a state that says pending, right? Lowercase, simple string, right? But then you want to say to the user, currently waiting for server feedback, right? So you want to put that string or a reference to your localizations for that string in with that enum, so they're tightly coupled, so that when you display it to the user and you get back that enum, you can detect, oh, we're in the pending state, and then I want to display a string, display the one from the enum, or look up the localization from the one that the enum's given me. So I'm kind of tightly coupling these things together. Mm-hmm. This is essentially like a union, right? Seal classes as well can be used for that.
So speaking of Kotlin data classes, I think it'd be cool to see something in Dart where, we have kind of this more flexibility, but a lot of the stuff we're having to do by boilerplate and code generation kind of be cool if like kind of Dart took it on itself, because like you said, enum with a class, another cool thing about that is you can write actually extension methods onto a class. You can't do that with an enum right now. Because I've wanted to do stuff like that as well.
Well, I mean, that's where that's where type aliasing comes in, right? So in type aliasing, you can say, a good example is, if you want to bind some things, tightly couple some things together, you can create a new class, which is a string, right? So good example, you can't put an extension on a string, right now. But if you could create a new type called server state, right, which is a string, and then you could then extend it with other things during runtime. There's lots of ways of coupling these things together, but also it's about not misusing extensions, because that's one of the other things, right? Like it's too easy to misuse extensions, and I've seen it already in several bits of code I've seen, like just throwing extensions around like all over the place, and then like where these things could have been methods. These things are not. You're using extension as a hack rather than actually architecting your software correct. Well, not correctly is the wrong word, but
versus
put it this way, you don't be looking at a class and going, oh, this is the class, and then figuring out, oh, at runtime, no, it has these other properties that are extension methods that I have no idea where these things were coming from, right?
Yeah, right.
Like I either tightly couple them together. They should be. I feel like that's where mixing's coming, right? So I feel like there's a use case for all these different ways of doing things, but the right thing for the right job, and extensions are there for me personally, is to actually extend things out of your control, right?
Gotcha.
So for instance, if you've got a package coming in from externally, or you've got something in the framework that you're trying to extend, right? For instance, one thing I did recently, which actually is part of architecture, is just to put extension on stateful widget and stateless widget that has a simple thing like database repository or database service that is a getter, right? That goes and uses provider of context or whatever to go fetch it, right? So instead of having now here's the key. So I'm still using the provider package as essentially an inherited widget, but I'm using it in one file. I'm not sprucing that provider import all over my application. Yeah. My application has no clue what provider is because it's only using the one place. I'm using it where I have a widget that provides things down the tree, and then my extension that goes and uses provider to fetch them from the current context.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure where I'm doing something wrong, but when using extensions, I cannot auto import them. Like I have an extension on something, and I know the extension is defined somewhere in my project, but I have to manually import the file.
They did add that recently, I believe. However, it only works on named extensions.
Oh, nice. Gotcha.
Yeah,
because that was always a big thing, because I knew I had that extension, but I had to manually go in and search for the file where it was in.
Yeah, but to be honest, I mean, here's the good example of that was using export, right? You should be exporting those extensions, right? So that when you import like certain something from your app, you want to bring the extensions along with it, well, then export them from that import. Does that kind of make sense? So that way the extensions come along with anything that uses that type of system.
Sometimes you have stuff on external libraries. For example, if you want to have an extension on datetime, for example, you cannot export datetime with your thing in one thing. So,
but what you can do is create one file which exports datetime and exports your no, seriously, you can export datetime and export your extension.
But you have to keep in mind to import that file instead of
but when you do your auto import, it will give you the options of both.
Yes, that's true.
That's cool.
Right? And then you get to choose the other one, right? But I mean, yeah, sure, nothing's perfect, right? I'm not going to go there. I mean, there's so many improvements that can be made, but this is all about, I mean, it all takes time and what is worth the changes, and these aren't worth any changes, right? This is all about using the language effectively, right? There should be a new book, Effective Dart.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of brings us into what we wanted to talk about today, which is, like state management for Flutter. And specifically, we want to talk about, like why do we want to choose a state management solution, and how can it help us? Because I feel like, especially, it feels like, when I first started with Flutter, it was like beta 2. It's like, we had all these things thrown around. It's like a scope model and streams and block. And it's like, oh, well, block is crazy big and it's all this boilerplate and there's Redux and, you have to do all this and they all have their trade-offs. And then it's like, all of a sudden we went from like crazy, just you write a bunch of code to all the packages are writing all the code for you. But like, you can't quite predict what's going on. Some you can. So yeah, just a lot of different things going on right now.
I mean, to be honest, someone asked me the other day, what one do I think is better? What state management solution would I recommend? And it's like, choose your poison, right? Because the term is actually incorrect, right? I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. State management is because you in Flutter specifically, you're talking about UI state, right? And managing your state of your application and its UI, because mainly the UI is reactive and that's what builds, and then that sort of affects your logic in some fashion. But what you want to do is, I have to remember early on in the very Flutter early days, even myself was guilty of this, of just inlining every function as part of my, my widget tree, and just, mishmash of code. And it's more about sort of separation of concerns, right? Mm-hmm. So I think separation of concerns is actually one of the solid principles of design from Uncle Bob, but it's one I go to as well, that dry and keep it simple and all those sort of standard things. But they're just sort of things to memorize to kind of just keep you sort of directed at how you should be doing stuff, right? So it's, when you do anything object oriented, it's always about separating off, naming things appropriately, structuring things to communicate with each other, so that when you come in and modify them, you're not having to trace down and refactor and just rewrite huge swaths of your code. You can just keep it in one location. Yeah. That's really sort of like that sort of sort of encompassing your logic in one place, or your code in one place. And I think that's really what it is, which is architecture, right? That's how you architect the classes of your application to interact with each other to produce your desired result of your app, right? So to produce that business logic. So when we talk about these patterns, like originally the patterns that we were seeing were talking about inherited widget, right? Which is just reaching up to get state from other widgets, right? Because the widgets would be driving the logic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anytime you interact from the widget tree, you're always using an inherited widget. It doesn't matter if you use a provider, scope, model, any of these, they're all based on inherited model. This is actually okay. Most of them, okay.
Yeah.
However, I can MobX, right, and other things. But the point here is, why does inherited widget exist in the first place, right? Why is it trying to solve? Do you know, Rody? Do you know Norbert?
It's just a tree data structure. You want to have your logic, where you can grab from one instance of a node to another side of, like.
It's just to shorten traversal.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of, it's a time saver and a performance gain. It's so basically what happens is it will go up the first time, right? Your access. They have changed this logic recently, and it does work slightly differently. So I'm not going to get this perfectly right, correct. But the idea is, like, whenever you need to look up the tree, right, you use your current context, right, your build context, and you've got they've renamed them, so they're now all find widget by this, and find state by that, and find inherited widget by this, and depends on that widget. So I won't go into. There's a whole long list of them. However, they're all about tree traversal, right? So they go up the tree. Now, if you look at those functions, so if you go into the Flutter framework and look at the element class, element is what implements build context, right? So every build context you see is actually your element for your widget, right? And what it will do is it literally traverses up to its parent and says, is parent this type? Or let's say you're looking at widget. So it looks at, is parent element widgets this type? No, then go up to next parent and next parent and next parent. So you go this ancestor path, right? Now the key is going up the tree is always less expensive than going down the tree, because you do a non-exhaustive search up the tree. You're going to your direct descent ancestor, right? If you're going down the tree, then you have a depth pass or breadth pass search in terms of going down to every edge leaf node of the tree.
Yeah.
So
going up is logarithmic, or even less, actually.
Yeah. But the key being here is, if you go up the tree, right, you're still looping over. You're still doing those if checks. So if every single time you needed to get that parent state or class, you would have to do that traversal. That's a waste of time, right? Waste of performance, especially during build or other things that you need to get things done in your frame limit, right? So then you kind of go down and go, well, okay, how do I solve this? Well, if you're trying to solve it yourself, you can solve this yourself, and that is, I will create a hash map, right? And I will key my type, right? And then I will store the value as being whatever I get from up the tree. Now, the first time I get it, I store in that hash map, and now each time I want to get a different type, I store in the hash map. That's literally how most of these sort of state things work, right? However, they do the next thing, which is that hash map is registered further up the tree. So if that type changes, it updates the hash map and notifies the children to rebuild. So really, truthfully, there's two things to this. Is one is to performance, going up the tree, and also to notify the children that they need to be rebuilt further down the tree without rebuilding the entire chain of widgets, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a performance win, right? And it's just a different way of doing it. It's the reactive model. So that's inherited widget, right? Scope model is just so inherited widget was inherently untype safe, should we say? There's some few sort of problems around using it. And it's not easy to get your head around it even now, right? So scope model came out. Scope model by the Beardosaurus himself, Brian. Yeah. I love calling him that. It's just every time I see him with that nice beard of his, it's like, how did he do that? That's amazing. The upkeep on that thing, blimey. Anyway, the scope model is sort of like just giving you that nice interface on top, and then giving you sort of like this idea of a model that you can then notify when a field changes and it updates the widget. It's essentially the same thing. And then there's a few, I'm trying to remember, there were a few other things that came out. In fact, I think the first
Redux
time
was out.
Sorry?
I said Redux came out right around
Redux,
that time
yeah.
too. Yeah,
Redux. Now, I really love the notion of a unidirectional data flow of immutable objects. I mean, that is
same.
Like you have a direct idea of the flow of your application. And one of the killers of most apps, in fact, I know back in the day when, oh my goodness, like 10 years ago when I was first doing Android apps, was that state, like having mutable state and changing the properties leads to literally every single bug you can imagine. And by just changing things to having immutable models solved so many issues, because it meant that you didn't have the possibility of not knowing that something had changed. Like you have a direct notion that truthfully inside the when it's about the Java engine, it happens in Dart, and most of the object-oriented systems is each object has your ID. It's literally its unique identifier in the system when it's been allocated, and that by default is the hash code, right? So so if you compare two hash codes of two objects that don't have an equals method, you're essentially saying, are these two things identical, right?
By reference, right?
Yeah. I mean, as an object, it's passed by reference, but still you're talking about the value, the implementation
they
of that
have the
class,
same
right?
reference. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they both exist in the same location.
Yeah. So anyway, I digress. But the point here is that scope model sort of even off the playing field, Redux comes in and we get this unidirectional data flow. We get the Redux behaviors, which work well with React. So that kind of brings another lot of people into Flutter in terms of React developers and so on. Like they're used to using Redux, and a lot of people have been using Redux in their apps. Mm-hmm. Then you start talking about RX, right? Using RX with Redux, and that kind of sort of brings in a new wave of people and a new way of doing things, because there's several things that are difficult to do, not impossible, but difficult to do with streams in Dart. Yeah. Then RX came in using it with observables. And then finally, I believe as of, I'm not going to quote the right version number, I think it was 023 of RX Dart, it now uses streams directly. So you can now use non-observable based patterns. So now stream, because of extension methods, it now has all of the standard sort of flat map on a stream. Mm-hmm. So you can just flat map the direct data type and not have to worry about like wrapping every one of your data types with an observable pattern, right? And having the next done and all that kind of jazz. Anyway, back to Redux. Yeah. So we had Redux, and then what was the other history? We had Redux.
MobX came out.
Sorry? MobX was after, but Provider, right? So Provider, I think, is the next big leap. I mean, trust me,
for sure.
Sorry?
There was Block for sure.
Block? No, sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. Block and Redux were around the same time. I think they came out around the same time, because I remember lots of conversations were about which one should I choose, right?
Yeah.
But again, Block, I personally have never followed Block to the letter of the specification, right?
Yeah, same.
In terms of, I don't use syncs a lot of the time, right, to send data to the blocks, right? I don't let it reveal a sync and then push stuff into a stream. Great for when you want to link blocks together and have stuff streaming through the pipeline, right? Where you reveal a sync and you can attach things together, right? But when you're talking about UI actions, I've never gone that route of, depends on what I'm doing, right? But I never really go that route of having a value or an event or something that I'm passing over a stream to the block, and then having the block churn that, change its state. I'm listening to the state on the front end, and then that returns back the new data or the update state which contains whatever. So yeah.
So one thing which is also interesting to talk about in this context is apps have a very specific way of handling data. And that's the reason why we need those things like streams, Redux. And that's because apps are very reactive. Like every possible configuration, all the data is based off of events. A user taps a button, something comes from a server, some sort of response, something is loading. So most parts of an app are asynchronous and very data driven. If that wouldn't be the case, like for example in servers where you have one request which is coming in, it is being processed, it's being piped through a lot of systems, you wouldn't need all this reactive behavior. But for apps, everything is interconnected and reactive, and that's also mainly the reason why we actually need these kinds of streams, why we need some sort of pattern which observes data instead of setting it.
I'm going to have to disagree just slightly. Not that it's not what it is right now for Flutter, but more about apps in general, right? So we're talking about, if you're talking about Flutter apps, because the reactive UI, it makes sense to have
No, I'm
streams,
talking about apps in general. Like I've been doing Android before too, and I know having mutable data, which you have to keep track of yourself. Like when is it changing? I have to know.
But what I'm trying to say is you still have immutable data, but you don't have to have streams necessarily. Like simple patterns of like a holder pattern where you have one object that is constant that holds onto a value, essentially as a reference, and then that has a notification when the value changes. These are other patterns that can be used.
Yes, but those are.
I digress. Sorry.
Definitely, yeah. So basically the idea is instead of having to manually keep track of when do I have to rebuild, when do I have to show something new to user, we lay off the responsibility of knowing when we have to rebuild to the actual part which is causing the rebuild.
I think there's also an interesting point. I was going to take me back, but when doing Android a long time ago, when RX Java came out on Android, and we started going with Java 7 lambdas, right?
Yes.
It suddenly became a pattern that you could then use RX effectively inside of your Android app, because you didn't have to do these anonymous class instances all over the place. You could just use lambda expressions. And the power really comes from setting up a pipeline, right? So essentially setting up your stream nodes, having your flat maps and your different manipulations of the data as it flows through the pipeline, and having essentially you could express the entire back end of your app as an interconnection of all of the pipes of a stream, right? I mean, it would be nuts, right? And trust me, I've seen people do it and try it and all sorts, right? And you go through a phase when you're trying RX, you're trying to do these kind of nice little cool things, right?
Yes.
I feel like there's like using anything effectively is don't, like they say, taking anything too much is a bad thing, right? Like having too much coffee is going to be a bad thing, right? The point here is like doing any one of these things over the top is always a bad thing. So I saw someone talking about, this was a while ago when RX first came out in Flutter, they were trying to make all of their widgets stateless.
Yeah.
And having like all the state pushed over into the Redux data stores and having all this kind of like, it was just like, in general, the principle sounds nice, right? But then you end up doing things like there might be state that only has to exist for that widget. It's part of the UI state. At that point, it depends. The place it should be located is inside the stateful widget, if that kind of makes sense. It's not something that you should be putting it outside of this. I mean, where else is it going to... You could back a class to every widget, right? So every widget can have a backing class with its logic, but then it's just a base class with functions in it and state, right, with variables, but you're just moving the problem, right? It's nice for organization, don't get me wrong, but that's architecture. That's not really the solution. Anyway,
like bottom navigation, I've seen people create a block just for the bottom navigation bar, and I'm like, it's like a self-responsible widget there. It's like only UI navigation. If you want to change the index, do it with the constructor and a did update widget. It's so much easier that way.
I think there's a point here where you're working against the frameworks. I mean, the framework comes with tools, so you don't have to use any of these patterns, right? Essentially, right? The base things are all there, like was just said with inherited widget. But going back, I have these different patterns, right? So we said Redux provider is one we haven't spoken about. So provider is to me the de facto standard now in terms of instead of using inherited widget, I go for provider, right?
Yes.
Mainly because it does all that hard work for me, and it's been heavily tested. It's got loads of stuff, and I don't have to deal with some of the minutia around setting up an inherited widget. So you have to set up another class. Essentially, you've got a scope class and some other things. And also the fact that provider is really, it's scoped model on steroids in terms of that you have all those other providers that take things, so you can have a change notifier provider. So when the change notifier it listens to that, so that when the change notifier is notified, it will rebuild the widget. So you're getting all these other patterns of that. All these other libraries or the way you structure your code can all depend on that sort of provider system, right?
Well, there's also another type too, which I use this data or state management solution for up until probably about 6 months ago, and that was using more or SQLite on the back end, having a unidirectional flow where I'm reading the data directly on the widgets, so that you have the stream listing on individual stuff, and then just using like a block or something to update the database in a single layer. But because that management was also pretty popular, but I just curious your thoughts on that too, because it also obviously depends on the data, but if you have a structured data kind of approach, it kind of can be nice to have like that unidirectional flow that way too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it really depends on what you're doing, because to be honest, it's about layering your application architecture then, right? For me. So I might have my front end UI deal with streams of my own data types in my application. I'm never going to pass a document snapshot, right, from Firestore to my front end of my application, right? Because now suddenly my entire application is now dependent on Firestore, right? So if I need to refactor Firestore out, I want to switch it to my own API, I want to put a caching layer in with SQLite, for instance, then I just kicked myself, right? It's not going to be an easy change to make, right? So you want to control each layer and keep each layer of your application independent. So that kind of goes into for what I was doing back in, so it's quite funny. What I was doing back in the Android days was using what we call repository service model. I'm trying to remember if there's some other better names for this, but this is the way I remember it, right? And it's that notion of having units of responsibility called repositories, right? They are responsible for some unique factors. Just think of it like a block, if you will, but some either some data type or some manipulation of something within your app. So let's say you had, let's say you're a music player, you had albums, right? So you'd have an albums repository, right? Yeah. Now, all your front end, whenever you need an album, you need to get an album cover or an ID, whatever it might be, you're going to go to the repository to deal with that data type, right? Or manipulate albums in some fashion, right? But then the albums might have to go off to Firestore. The albums repository might have to go to Firestore to actually go retrieve it from the database, or go off to Google Cloud Storage to retrieve the cover URL, so I can pass back a in-memory one and cache it in memory and whatever I want to do. But that's all business logic on the back end of your application. It never touches the UI, right? The idea is on the UI, I get an album model and it has all the fields I need to display on my screen, right? So essentially, almost think of it like a view model in that sense, right? But that's the pattern I feel like is just the most flexible, rather than having something like, you can obviously essentially, it's a bit abstract, but you can also then go one level deep and have something between repository and your UI and have controllers, right? That sort of notion of, I have a top level controller for my application, which kind of wires some stuff up, or essentially a block. So it's another model I've done where you have blocks, repositories, and services, and the blocks just provide that bit of business logic in between your widget layer, do the reactivity part, and then go off into the repository layer or the service layer to do things, right? But the idea is that you have a repository layer, which is like, as I said, like albums, and then above that, if you had Firestore, that would be a service layer, right? Your choice as to whether, if you're doing this model that I use, is if you want the service layer to return back data models from your class, or if you want the repository layer to also have access to Firestore in that fashion, right? So it gets the document snapshots, and then you deal with the mapping from serialized data type or transmission data type to your local model data type. If that's going to happen at the repository layer or the service layer, that depends on your application. I personally try and keep two sets of models, right? So you have your model that you're using within Firestore, within your database, that might be IDs for other objects, right? But then when it comes to your object on the front end, you want to link those two objects together. So you might do two fetches, or maybe have it in cache. So you want to do two SQL queries and bind those things together, and then you're passing off to the front end. So the front end has what it needs to display that data for what it needs to manipulate that data. And that's what your application does, right? So really, the trade-off, and the other trade-off here is that your repository and service layer must not. You need to keep it completely Flutter free, right? So you never have providers in those. You don't deal with any of the. If you're dealing with the Flutter, any of the Flutter sort of framework in your backend, then I feel like that's probably not where it's supposed to be, because Flutter is like your UI, your front end, right?
Right.
I try and keep them off. However, saying that, there is one dependency which you can't do at the moment, that is change notifier or value listenable. Those things are in Flutter Foundation. So, you're not going to import just those. So do that kind of import show value listenable. So you're just importing that one thing. You're not going to be chanced into using those classes from Flutter, which you shouldn't be using. Like a good example of this, right? This is just silly, but it's a good example of when these practices are important. Color as a class is a UI Dart specific attribute, right? If you want to now take this model object or this other piece of code and put it on your backend and use it in your server side, or do some other stuff with this backend piece of business logic, or move stuff around, suddenly you've got dependency on Flutter, right? So instead, what you should be doing is storing the integer representation, right? Which is actually what color is in computer terms. A color object just literally hides an int value inside it, right? With some methods, right? There's a good example of an alias type, right? If you could do an alias type, color would be a good example of doing it, right? You can have color be an alias of integer with the methods on top. So you're essentially extending. It's not really what it's for, but I digress. Anyway,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Anyway, back to the point here is that a good use of that is putting color in your front end models, but not in your back end models, right? So what you're sending to and from the server is either a string or an integer or some other representation of your color, and then you convert between your meta type or wherever you're transmitting, serializing back and forth from your services into your model that you use for the front end, and then you convert it to a color then, right? This gives you that layer of control and complexity that you can get around, right? And then you can prepare your front end models however you want in your repository layer. Anyway, I digress. Sorry.
Yeah, I think, by the way, and just a quick note on the models and repositories and services, I think Rx Command was a state management solution that came out that was kind of all built around that, specifically on top of streams.
Yeah. So Thomas's Rx Command with to use Rx Dart and also use along with Get It and kind of that kind of stuff. So sort of package. He came out with Rx VMS as well, which uses Rx Command as well. Cool. Personally, I've actually worked with on a few projects with Thomas actually, and we've used those patterns. Personally, I feel there's use for these things where sort of essentially for me, Rx VMS is more like a node, right? So it's kind of a node for a block. It's like a front end for a block, which gives you a stream for when it's loading, for when state changes, and you kind of like you have these streams. Now it means that you can connect multiple of these RSVMX blocks almost together. So you can have loading go from one as an input to another. So one's finished, another one starts. So you can have Rx commands being sent and transmitted between these things. So anyway, it's a nice system, but I find it. For me personally, I find most of these things overly complicated, right? Like keep it simple, right? Exactly. Like for me, block is overly complicated for most of my use cases. Like I don't want to have to go. I feel like I'm putting extra boilerplate in, the same as Redux. I end up putting way more boilerplate into my applications for not that much gain, right? I feel like, don't get me wrong, use a pattern and use it throughout your application, but it doesn't mean you can't use multiple things together. Like you can use provider with Redux, right? Like the two things are not like don't have to be separated. You can't.
I mean, in the end, architecture, all it is to make code for you easier. If you write good code, which you can edit fast, which you can modify, understand, and build on top of, which doesn't use any kind of architecture, but just mutable web variables, that's fine if it works. But most often than not, it doesn't work. People get confused, bugs happen. And just keeping as much as simple is, in my opinion, key. Like if you have a stateful widget, which has some logic, which is very encapsulated, which doesn't have to be connected to our blocks, to streams, put it in a widget, in a stateful widget, use that state. You don't have to use streams and all that stuff. But once it gets interconnected with your other system, fetches data from that, it combines it with some data from there. Suddenly, this simple widget, which should have just taken 1 second to skim over and understand, requires a lot of mental capacity to understand. You have to go through your project and look there. Okay, make sure you don't break something there. So in regards to boilerplate, if the boilerplate helps you to reduce the mental strain on understanding this component, it's great. But if you have something simple, which boilerplate code adds on top to, and like it makes you feel uncomfortable looking at the code. I know this feeling if you have this code which you really don't want to touch.
Bad smell code, right?
Yes.
This code's got bad smell to it.
Sometimes, I mean, sometimes it could be good architectured code, but just over-engineered. Like it's solid, good written code, but it's like this simple feature which you just want to edit, and you have to look at these two different places.
I mean, the other thing to mention here is testing, right? Like these architectures and patterns all afford you to be able to test them, right? So the case in point there is if you need to be able to test that piece of logic, make sure you have. It doesn't matter if you're sort of not using block, right? Because test it a different way. But my point here is just make sure that testing is part of that whole whatever architecture you come up with. You need to make sure that you're covering all those edge cases that you might not possibly think of at runtime.
Yeah, especially, and also I think. Not just testing, but be able to debug. Like if like a user has an issue, I think that's a really cool feature of block in Redux, for example. You can actually replay the state of the error of what they had. You can see all the events leading up to that and everything at whatever was happening at the time.
In fact, I did something similar in it wasn't Redux, but I did something similar, and that is a nice tool that you can do is to keep a log of the last X transactions, if you will, or whatever events that occurred within your application. And these can just be any event you like, right? Just imagine they're things that have occurred, like the app went and fetched like the list of albums, right, from a repository. Now that's an event. You log that event, so you have a local log within your application, and it's a series of log entry items, right? And then what happens when a crash occurs, you can now collect that up, serialize it into a JSON array or into a text block, and that gets dumped over to your exception capture, crash capture, error reporting system, and that gives you that kind of event log of what happened. This is not just Redux, is what I'm trying to get at, right? Like, and the same goes for there's lots of these things, right? Like nothing. You're not limited. One of the reasons why I really like Flutter and Dart is the limitations are gone.
Yes.
You have no idea. I don't think anyone that hasn't used Android as long as I have for that 10-year period and knows. It's kind of funny. Someone asked me a bit like why, I can't remember what it was. It was like why something happens in Android the way it does. I'm like, oh, that's because in version 1 it did this, and it's still there to this day. And it's like there's these, so it's almost archaic, right? In terms of, again, it's an operating system. It has to be, and it's one of the reasons why they didn't put their move to using the support library, right? And Android X and all this is because they don't have to put the widgets in the framework anymore, where you wouldn't get those functions, and it was such a pain to having to backwards compatibility and having to say, oh, if you don't have this function, you should use this other function. Or I'll put my own polyfill in its place to perform those necessary features to do something that the platform now contains is pointless. I might as well just do it in my own application at that point, right?
Yeah.
So that's where their sort of compact libraries came from and all this kind of support stuff. But the entire system is still limited, like just trying to deal with like resources and resource qualifiers and the ordering of resource qualifiers and how it's going to select the right resource in Android is just mind-boggling a lot of the time, right? And you end up, I remember a lot of the time in some big applications I worked on, I ended up doing type resource aliasing, which is when you basically add a fake XML tag, which is a resource tag, which basically just directs to another resource, so you can get around the limitations of the resource selection. So on this specific use case for the specific language in this locale, and then I want you to use this very specific layout and not the default one or something, right?
Oh, wow.
Like crazy stuff. When something in Dart and doing Flutter, I'm like, oh wow, just assets. I can put them in any folder I want. I can structure them however I want. I'm free, and it's like. Like this, the same goes with code. It's like it's kind of interesting because it's kind of two fundamental patterns, right? People come to Flutter and Dart, like localization. How do I do it? What pattern must I use? However you want. Yeah. Whereas the answer is as long as you get a string, load it from a JSON file in your assets, Download it from a server. You have the freedom to perform those things however you want, right? And to do them however you want. Compile time, run time, you name it, you can do it. The freedom is there. Whereas on Android, it's like, no, you must do it with the XML language options. You must do it like this. And if you don't want to do it like that, you have to implement the entire framework yourself and override a load of widgets and views and how you do all this. It's like, digress. But you get my point. It's that freedom.
But even like having the freedom is great, but sometimes having too much freedom could be a curse too. Like, when there's so many options, like especially if you're new, you're coming there and everybody's just telling you, okay, do whatever works for you. And you're like, I have no idea what works for me.
There's a name for that, information overload, or that kind of like, it's kind of like there's so many options, I don't know where to turn.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right, that is the problem. Right, that we have in Flutter and Dart a lot of the time is like we talk about like people. This is really where that question comes from. What state management solution should I use? It's like there's so many to choose from. There's so much stuff to do. Not understanding it right as a principle, or as like the fact that it's more or less architecture. Right, it's not about the term state management is really the wrong name for it. It's architecture a lot of the time. Right, for us, it's more about the state management is just a tiny little bit of traversing the widget tree to get to your widget state, right? Essentially, that's where state management came from. Is that kind of manipulation of your UI state. But truthfully, like it's like block isn't that, right? Block isn't state management. Block is an architecture pattern, right? Like it's a way of dealing with your UI, right? Same goes for provider is inherited widgets, like they're kind of just traversing the tree and sort of providing some of that sort of extra stuff that we kind of want. But anyway, I digress. Right. So sorry.
Well, also, with that too, people, have all these things when they come to Flutter and they see these options. But, one thing that I've been doing recently is I just ask them straight up, okay, what's the data doing? Like, how is the data flowing? Yeah. Because 9 times out of 10, the data decides the state management solution. If you're building a graphics application, like I did with Widget Studio, I'm not going to be using SQLite and all this kind of stuff to store all these individual things. Most of it's going to be in memory. Most of it's going to be some sort of serialization. And I use value notifiers to update individual things. But then if I'm building, a business application, I'm going to be using some sort of SQLite or using something like that.
So one thing I just thought about inherited, we cannot forget inherited model, which was added later on in the game.
Yep.
Also used, I think, by Scope Model in the end for its model stuff, and there's a few other places used. I'm not sure if Remy's using it, but I know the new Select does essentially the same thing, where you can essentially look at when a specific field or value has changed, rather than having to rebuild on whenever an object changes. So you get that kind of finer level of control. Mm-hmm. But most of this is just about the question I always ask people is like trying to ask. They ask a question like, I'm trying to think of how do I position a widget? Like, how can I position a widget at a specific XY coordinate? And you're like, but what are you trying to do? And they kind of say, no, I'm trying to position a widget. No. That's your solution, but what is your problem you're trying to solve? And when they explain the problem that they're trying to solve, it's like, no. Do it like this. This is the reactive way of doing it. You should put this widget in there. You should put a line in there. You can animate your line, and that will give you your best, smoothest way of doing it. And it doesn't matter what size the device is, it's going to like traverse the entire screen. You're no longer dealing with pixel coordinates, right? Like it's just ways of thinking about this. Is the key. That one of the reasons why Flutter is just, to me, a good thing, right? But it's a good and bad thing, right? The fact of it's so different that it solves a lot of the problems that we've been having. So it's like if I was to be on the team that wrote Android again, and we had a chance to like just that's it. We're just going to kill Android right now. And we're going to rewrite Android. No. The point is, like Android 10 or whatever version, right, is going to be a ground up rewrite of the entire Android system. How are we going to do it? Some of the principles, at least, of Flutter are the ones that I'm going to be choosing for doing some of this stuff because of those of the way it really brings the developer experience of making apps forward, right, where it needs to be. And that kind of sort of goes back to that point of. Now I've lost my train of thought.
Well, I would just say real quick, it's nice that, a lot of people that are kind of on the fence of Flutter don't realize that in 3 years, Flutter can still be whatever it wants because it's not tied to Android or iOS. And I think that's really cool because the state management solution is you build it how you need it. Like we don't depend on the update cycle. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I love and chose Flutter, was because I can have my same application on iOS 8. I can have it on KitKat and like the lowest Android and not have to use the libraries or depend on any UI there.
It's an interesting point, right? One of my selling points that I had at one of these Android conferences, because I think I am an Android developer. I look at the crowd of people at these Android conferences because I was you. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm not trying to there's no sort of realization that if you want to use it, use it. If you don't want to use it, don't use it, right? I don't care. But I want you to try, because once you try, then you might realize what the benefits are, right? Like hot reload and hot restart. Oh my God, I was waiting. I would spend so much of my day waiting for Gradle Build to have no idea, right? A picture of a programmer at his computer desk with it's a skeleton, with a cup of coffee. It's kind of for me most of the days. I'm just sitting there, just waiting for a progress bar. Right?
It's wasted time. You're not learning or doing anything.
Exactly. And then
same for Xcode though too. It was really bad.
No, this is it. And then suddenly, you suddenly get this hot reload and hot restart thing, and then suddenly, what do you mean? I just hit save. Yeah. And I click on the button again, and it performs different code. I'm like, mind blown.
Without navigating to the screen, and it's you get to stay. You don't have to refill out the form. You could just update the field. Yeah.
I mean, this kind of process. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that's so underutilized, and I want to tell this to people because a lot of people don't know, is reassemble. Reassemble is a function on stateful widget that gets called when you hot reload only during development, right? Meaning that you can make your widgets react during development how they would not react during. So you can have it reload a widget or an object from your backend database, right? So you don't have to do hot restart. So those instances where you go, oh, it didn't get the right state, or it's got this old thing, I have to hot restart, right? Reassemble fixes those issues, right? So that's what the people need to think about. When you get those issues, reassemble is your first thing to go to and say, what can I do during reassemble that's going to make my development life experience, my development experience of building this form or building this sort of front-end system easier. That's where it comes into its own.
I haven't used it before. I mean,
this is it, right? It's one of these underutilized features, I tell you.
Can potentially save a lot of time,
Because at least at the very minimum, you could just start with just calling the init method over again.
Yeah,
because that usually will fix a lot.
So all you need to do is a lot of time is cancel whatever streams and restart your streams, whatever you were doing in init. So cancel them and then call init state again.
Dispose in it,
disposing in init essentially, right? But obviously there's side effects to doing that in terms of you're calling the super classes and you don't know if you've got mixins and what else is going on, right? But my point here being that it's a method, right? And you get to do whatever you want in that method, and it gets called during hot reload on every widget, on every stateful widget.
Speaking of which, I think it's a good time to mention that yes, there is K-debug mode now, constants that people don't realize, and you can check to see if you're in profile mode or release mode. So in your code, a lot of people don't know about that, and just like you can do if you're on web and stuff like that.
So it's K-debug, right? It's lowercase k, capital D, debug, right? One word, and that's saying no if you're in debug. Oh my God, do you know how I was doing it before for years before I knew that? I can't remember, when did that come out? Like a year ago now? I don't know. It's a while ago. We do the assert. You set a Boolean flag and you return that Boolean flag. So it's because asserts are only kept for debug. So if it returned true, you're in debug. Now that was the way of doing it. That was so frustrating. Nice. And then suddenly to have all it is an environment variable, right? It's a Dart defined essentially, right? They get sent across and it's detected. But yes,
is the code which you wrap in that if statement being cut out, optimized out? Because I think with assert, the actual code which you have in there is being thrown away.
Now that is a good point. I believe, you know what, you have just brought up a point there. So during compilation, the string from environment, I believe, is a constant expression.
So it should be optimized out, right?
But I'm not sure now you mention it, So one of the interesting points to make, which is something that actually someone said to me the other day, was if I build my Flutter web app with Skier, right, you do the extra Dart define flags. When I build in release mode, I'm not specifying that flag when I run it, right? So how does it know?
I usually specify it when I do release mode.
No, but the key point here is no. What I'm trying to say is once it's been built.
Oh, once it's been built, gotcha.
So this is my point. So the Dart code when it runs, if you look at the way that works, right, in the Flutter web framework, it literally does one of these string from environment variable. Is this environment variable for the Dart defined set? Yes. Then choose this code path, else choose this other code path, right?
Yeah.
Now, the key here is that those things are done as overrides to the normal process environment variables.
Yeah.
Right. I might be wrong, but that's from what I remember.
On iOS and Android, and especially macOS, when you run a defined variable, it actually updates the generated config with that new variable set to whatever value. So then at release mode, it just reads from the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my point here is it's part of the compilation process is compiled into your application, right? So during it's one of those interesting things. During development mode, it's dynamic, but during release, it's baked in, right?
Yeah.
That process. But my interesting point here is because it's baked in, does it get the tree shaking side of the compiler, right? Does it strip out those code parts that's no longer ever going to travel down because those are baked in? I'm not sure, and I think that's what Norbert was getting at. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it would be nice if they could also throw in the version that your app is on from the inside the compilation process for your variable. I know they do that for the release mode, but yeah.
So there's build_version, I think is the widget. That's right, is the package. And what it does.
No. I've done packages for it, but what I mean is I think it'd be cool if just like you can read from environment, it'd be cool if you could do get the version from environment, because they have that at the build time.
Sure. I mean, but you can set that yourself during your sort of your any CI environment that you're doing, right? I mean, you're not. For
the application to read itself, so you can show what your change log and stuff like that without having to use a package for it. That's what I was meaning.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? The point here is not about that, right? I think the point here is what do you want the framework team to manage and own? Because they can't do it all, right? So it's nice to say, we want all these features, but then they have to be owned by someone at Google, right? And that takes staffing and other things, right? Away from potential other things that we need doing, like bug fixing and other things, right? And desktop and all these other things that we want from Flutter, right? It's like we're like a bunch of kids with knives and forks going, I want my food, I want, and it's like. So that's where that kind of community and packages come from, right? Being able to do these things ourselves, and that's one of the nice things. Just going back to that freedom that Flutter gives. These are all things. Do you want to put something in the build process? Make a package. Do something during the build process. You can do that, no problem. And a good example of this is I'm just looked it up now. It's build_version. That's the one. And what it does is it takes the package version from your YAML during the build process and puts a constant value in your app in a data file. Okay, then you just read that constant, right? So every time you build your app, you get the right version inside your your apps without having to cross. The key difference, right, is if you were to do this with package info. Package info gets it from the Android package information or the iOS bundle information, right? Which means it has to cross the bridge and it has to go away and it has to do all this other stuff. Again, it's, to be honest, the zero performance impact on your application because it's not zero, but it's negligible because you're doing it once, right? Yeah. You're doing it once when you display your about screen or your info screen or your menu or whatever it might be, where you display that version. You're doing it then, right? What you're not doing it is 60 times a second. So you would not want to use this platform bridge, as you know, serialization deserialization process. You don't want to be using that thousands of times a second, hundreds of times a second, because of course you're going to get lag, because now you're trying to squeeze something in one frame of 16 milliseconds and suddenly you're easily going over that limit. Now, of course, async and away isolates won't go into there, right?
Right.
Yeah, we'll be here for days. But,
I think wrapping up the architecture part, correct me if I'm wrong, for people deciding and thinking about architecture and state management, a few things to take away from this episode is keep it simple. If there's something which sounds complicated, requires a lot of boilerplate code and just doesn't feel right, don't do it. Use something which works for you, which is simple, and most importantly, you understand. If you write code that you don't understand, who else gonna understand it? Also, Flutter is very data-driven, very reactive. So maybe shifting the viewpoint from UI to the data when architecting applications might make sense. Because instead of looking at, what is happening where, look at the data. How is it flowing? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? Did I miss something?
Definitely be, just choose it based on the data flow and not because of, because it's popular at the time, for sure.
I mean, again, like don't start doing like second or third order functions and like functions that return functions that return functions, because you're gonna get into a problem somewhere. Don't overcomplicate things, right?
Yeah, just real quick, I wanted to check and see, what the general vibe was. I know right now a lot of people are trying to decide between layers and features, or folders by feature or folders by layers. What do you guys do? For me personally, I love having a UI folder, a source folder, and each one of those, like in the UI folder, I have a folder per screen, and inside each screen folder, I have an entry point and probably a common folder, and then a main common folder for all widgets. And the backend has classes, models, utilities, and stuff like that. So, what about you guys?
Well, I think I've kind of I've done it both ways, right? And I think you can even mix the two, so you can have like sort of feature level stuff if you want to. But I kind of feel like if I'm going to separate all my, let's say I was doing MVC, right? I have all my models in one place, all my views in one place, all my controls in another place. Maybe that makes sense, right? Right, doing it that way. However, if I'm going to do things with the way I feel, is normally where I have like a screens folder, or right, that has like then a subfolder for each one of my main sections of my app, call them screens, maybe top level things, and they can have any of the widgets and the things related to that in them, right? And it includes, if I might have blocks, then it might be in there as well, right? They're related to those screens, right? Then I would have a widgets folder at the top level, which is like generic widgets. So if I have a toolbar, for instance, that used across every screen, then I want that above that, like the specific screen layer. Then I'm putting that in that widget sort of essentially common area. I also normally make a backend folder, which is the back end of the application. And anything, this is my layering, right? So I'll put then inside there my services. I have a services subfolder, repeat repos subfolder, and I'll have my service and repositories. So I can keep, if I wanted to, I can literally lift out that backend folder into a separate package. And now I've got a backend package that's completely separate to my front end UI if I wanted to, right? But it's mainly about just knowing when you cross that barrier, right? Like you have imports from a completely different top level of your app. You've crossed a layer, right? So you can visually see that a lot of the time. So it's just more of a hint than anything else. I mean, and of course you have.
So for me,
go on.
I used to be with different layers before, but over time I shifted more and more into grouping features together, because for me, most often than not, when working on an application, instead of working on a layer, I usually work on a feature. And instead of just staying in the layer, I usually cross the boundaries between, okay, I have to adjust this model, I have to also adjust the UI, and maybe some backend calls. So usually when being in this work context, I'm usually in the context of one feature and I have to access most of the parts. So also as an example, when using Firestore, you don't have that much backend you want to separate maybe. Having all that in one folder, for example, for me, having a feature folder, in that feature folder, having a UI folder, a network folder, maybe a storage folder, which may extend some base class, which is in a top level layer separated folder, makes sense, because when touching that specific feature, I can touch every class and stay in the same subdirectory.
I did just think, when you were just saying that, I did actually think of one thing I do, and that is make an app folder. And that contains my top level like theme, or also I have an app.dart, which is normally my top level entry point, which is like contains the material app and any of that associated materials. Because main, I feel like main should just be your entry point. Main is just your main method. That's it, right? I feel like if it needs, in your main method, you need to go to the back end and initialize stuff, and then bring up your UI. So then you're calling the app. But I feel like don't just pile lots of stuff into your main.dart. It actually comes from, I don't believe it's a problem anymore, but there used to be a problem with imports when you had an import from two different, a local as well as a package path that used to conflict and used to have same type problems. I'm not sure if that bug was solved now, but
Yeah, it's solved. I don't have that anymore.
But I kind of learned myself into not doing that main problem, because it would always happen when you had stuff in main and you'd try and use it elsewhere and you'd get that issue. Because main's the entry point, it would always have everything local, right? And then if you try and import them with the package path later, it'd be two different type instances. But either way, like you normally, I hate flavors, right? I mean, like you talk about flavors in architecture, right? Like I normally do this main underscore dev, main underscore prod, main underscore whatever, each one of my different flavors, right? Testing, whatever it might be. and then I can then spin up, the main method can spin up different constant values based on that. So I can now tell my application, oh, it's in the dev mode or in the production mode or in this. So I can have different behaviors. So I can have more logging perhaps when I'm in the dev mode, or I'm using the dev backend rather than the production backend, and you can make those sort of differences. So it's also a very important part of architecture. So.
Yeah. Yep. Well, Simon, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. We definitely want to chat in the future more about this. We could go on probably for a week on all the different topics on this. But yeah, I just want to thank you so much for, taking the time here, talking about the subjects. And is there anything that you would like to promote while you're on?
Oh, now you dropped me in it. All right, let me, you can cut this bit out, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So we've got the upcoming Hack 20, soon to be released. We'll be releasing more information on the website soon, where lots of people heavily sort of working around the back end here at the moment, trying to get things ready for the day. So yeah, if anyone's interested in the Flutter Hackathon, we did it last year. Good success. Obviously, it's all in person, 70 locations worldwide, 24-hour live stream, which we will not be repeating this year, but we will be doing some live streams. Yeah, so if you're interested and you want to be involved or you want to sign up to Hackathon, go to the website, flutterhackathon.com, and sign up into the mailing list, and you'll get notified when we get more information going out the door.
Awesome. Yeah, and then also Flutter community, make sure to reach out there too. I know you're one of the heads of it too.
Yeah, I guess.
Norbert, what about you? Actually, real quick, I'll cut this out. And where can they find you, Simon, online?
Best place to, I guess, get hold of me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @DevAngelsLondon. Kind of regret doing my company name because I was using my company name to begin with, but now it should be personal. But that's what it is. And I think that's probably the best sort of communications through that. You've also got, I've got people adding me on LinkedIn. I just don't accept anyone on LinkedIn unless I know them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just I got to draw the line somewhere, because I'm not joking. I have I've had to stop following people back because I'm not joking. I get 10 followers down. I don't know these people. I don't like people. It's kind of interesting that people think that they see that I'm following someone and they go, "Oh, he must know this person, right?" Like that's giving
exactly.
I'm giving someone else authority. I don't know. In a way. I'm sort of upping them, so I feel like I can't just start. I got to stop doing that, right? And it's not out of malice or anything like that. Just I can't. Yeah. In a plus 9 that I've turned off the alerts. I can't. There's too much.
Yeah. What about you, Norbert? Where can they find you?
As usual on Twitter. Yes, mainly Twitter, I'd say. I'm always on the podcast, so you'll hear me next week or the week after. I don't know when it's next going to be. Yes. What about you, Rody?
Yeah, you can always find me on Twitter at Rody Davis and GitHub. And yeah, we'll have links to everything that you've seen in the description and the show notes. So make sure to, rate us on iTunes. It really helps, and Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen to us. And I want to thank you so much for listening today. We look forward to seeing you in a future episode coming soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.